Like, and I know the book is that this troll army memed Donald Trump into office, but it really is more that this is indicative of perhaps a certain mentality that was existing, that Donald Trump took advantage of both in real life and online on some level. But to what extent do you think that this was used by Bannon to create? I mean, how do you think this was leveraged by him?
It was leveraged fairly well. He was sort of ahead of the curve at that point and realized that there was sort of this new coalition of young men that would vote for Trump, which is sort of unusual, right? The idea that in 2016, 2017, youth counterculture sort of breaks off and it kind of goes to the far right is pretty wild.
But it's not that many votes, right? I mean, they didn't get that many votes.
Yeah, right. So the idea is that the question of how many people voted is sort of, or how much it mattered sort of culturally is sort of a different issue, right? So,
right.
It's not like this is the entire Trump coalition, right? There's sort of, there's still sort of all of these, one percenters who love that Trump's in office and all of these fooled white working class voters in the middle of the country, right? And then there's these people, right? So it's one coalition that Bannon realizes will also vote for him, and also sort of be the sort of cutting edge of meme creation. So like when Donald Trump tweets himself as Pepe the Frog, right? That's a 4chan symbol of loserdom. And when Donald Trump does it, he tags Breitbart in it, right? Like, so the idea is that they're sort of generating this sort of like cultural campaign that is going to look that makes Donald Trump look sort of cutting edge, and right. Hillary looked like behind the curve because she always is a little behind the curve already, right? So like it kind of re-emphasizes that. I mean, they've since sort of become disenfranchised or a little disenchanted with Trump, right? The Trump's incompetence has fragmented this coalition a little bit, but it still exists. It's just they're not too enamored of Trump anymore.
So where does this phenomena that you write about, where is it? I mean, place it for us, right? Because I'm looking at like, we have, let's say the IDW, right? Where someone like Shapiro comes out of the Breitbart world. Keeps some distance, I think, from that now, but it's not that too far of distance. Peterson and on some level Sam Harris. These are folks who and Joe Rogan to a certain extent even. Maybe perhaps a little bit more distant, but they all offer like a direction for young men as to like, this is how you can better yourself and empower yourself. There's a how-to quality to that. And we also, we still have sort of the hard alt-right, although they seem to have lost some traction. Bannon seems to be adrift. Like, where are these people? Is this phenomena over and it's just mutated into different things, or what?
I mean, it's certainly mutating, right? It's on the internet, so it mutates fast, and we've seen it mutate a lot. But it's not over. So Charlottesville, I would say it sort of has 2 or 3 sections, right? There was the Gamergate era. Then there's sort of the Trump era where they're emboldened. They go outside. Bannon has mobilized them. And then there's this third sort of post-Charlottesville era where the underlying phenomenon, right? These men still are disenfranchised. They still have very few prospects and sort of hope in their life. And they still sort of live very dark, nihilistic lifestyles, right? Like life hasn't really gotten better for young people. They're still mired in debt and sort of on the bottom of the economic ladder. So those main causes are still there. So it's still there. The question of what form it takes, well, we now know there's been a lot of good reporting, and I'm still writing on it. And so the idea is that they're back on the internet. They're afraid to go outside. When they do have rallies, I go to the rallies, and they're sort of now embarrassed at being humiliated, sort of in this culture. Most of them, they used to sort of be bold. Now they're sort of afraid to talk to me a lot of the time. But they're now on the internet, and they're hanging out in Discord groups. They're hanging out on 4chan and 8chan, and really, when they do go out, is when they're so despairing and nihilistic that they want to murder a bunch of people. That was the New Zealand shooting, and then the copycat shooting in Poway, California. Those were both 8chan shooters. So it sort of like links into this mass shooter phenomenon where a lot of those guys were alt-right. So it's still there, and we don't know what form it's going to take. But as you say, like, what happens is these sort of like hucksters at the top, the YouTube dads that are selling a lifestyle and sort of a way to pick yourself out of that lifestyle. Like, they constantly are in the state of shuffling and replacing one another, right? Like, so Yiannopoulos is out and then Peterson gets in or whatever. And that's still there, right? There's still a whole set of them. And it's like, how else do you explain them? Because they're idiots, other than the idea that there's sort of this force bubbling up, pushing them from the bottom, which is this sort of mass. Like, how do they have those big numbers? It's because there's a ton of kids, like, at Taco Bell who are educating themselves and raising themselves online. They don't know. Like, that's the closest they'll get to philosophy.
Who are those YouTube dads now?
I mean, you name them, right? Like, there's Peterson, Gavin McGinnis, Stephen Molyneux or whatever.
Stefan Molyneux, yes.
I mean, it's just, yeah. Like, there's so many of them. And of course, like, this is also keys into a larger sociological phenomenon where if you're just that age, no matter what your political standing, you're on YouTube, you're hanging out on Discord, you're probably not reading much. Like, I work as a college professor, and it's hard to get my students to read books, but they're on YouTube constantly, right? So they're just getting all their information from YouTube. So, like, this subset of them who are sort of, like, really despairing and happen to be young men, they're drawn to, like, hang out, in a sense, sort of virtually with these sort of, like, YouTube dads or sort of YouTube gurus who are like, oh, I'll help you out. I'll figure out life for you.
Let me ask you this about, like, how many people do you think we're talking about? Like, when we talk about, people unfortunately, I mean, and you say you go out and see them in public. I mean, because I think certainly my own personal experience on, let's say, Twitter, I think I get an outside notion of how many people are actually on Twitter, because it really is, it feels like everybody's on Twitter, but that's just because I know a narrow set of people, and they're all sort of like-minded, and it just so happens to be that is the key demo for, that's the people I follow on Twitter. But Twitter, is not necessarily representative except for, a specific group. Like, how many people are we talking about here? Because on some level, I still think we're living in an era where we have yet to fully socialize. Society is not caught up with social media. Like, we don't, we had a period where it's like, this guy's got 100,000 Twitter followers. We should get him a book deal. And then you find out, well, it doesn't really work that way. But, nobody's going to buy that book necessarily. But how many people are we talking about?
I mean, that's a really good question. I know that, 4chan is still one of the most popular message boards on the internet, right? There's thousands and thousands of posts an hour or something. So these sites get huge numbers. I am not like a pollster, like, I'm not a numbers guy, so I don't know, like, estimating the sort of the size of the population. I probably get the figure very wrong. I mean, I guess, like, I sort of approach from the other end where I'm, like, looking at someone like Jordan Peterson, and you're like, why, right? Like, how does he have 1 million people listening to him? Like, who are those people, right? So there's sort of like these people who are, to me, not saying very smart things, but they have these huge followings, or Gamergate, right? It's like, well, why did millions of people do this, right? Though, yeah, like, compared to sort of the size of the United States, I'm not sure. I mean, to me, just sort of like teaching college, right? All my students know about this. This is sort of the culture they're in, right? And so I think if you're a young person, I've tried to sort of fairly describe young people's culture in general, right? So this is sort of a large aspect of it. This is sort of how they regard their politics and their reality, that it's going through YouTube or going through certain message boards. But I guess that's sort of a dance around the idea that I don't know. I don't know how many,
and number, I mean, the thing is, it may not be important. Right? Like it's not like I mean, if we had the ability to say like we're going to determine that you need to constitute this amount size of the population to legitimately have this type of authority in our society, and you and I had the ability to do that, it would become more relevant. But what's more fascinating is that it could be very few people, and it's creating.
That could be.
It's in charge of our culture, which is also, frankly, the reality with things like cable news, right? I mean, we have a very small group of people in cable news who are determining what we decide is our news. I mean, it's sort of a fascinating dynamic. Where do you, lastly, where do you think it goes from here?
I think it will remain online, and we'll probably see another manifestation in the physical world eventually. It's going to, I think, persist as a political coalition of some sort, that it's not going away, and nor are unfortunately, the mass shootings are going away either, that they've still gone on every month or so. So I think if the underlying causes are addressed, if in some way, the left has better answers for this coalition, right? Like actual real ways out of poverty, sort of actual real opportunities. If I think the left does well in the next election cycle and reaches out to them, then the coalition could be broken up, right? Like, for example, weirdly, like on 8chan and 4chan, like 2 or 3 months ago, half the coalition was like, oh no, we don't like Trump anymore, we like Andrew Yang, because we want $1,000 a month, right? So it's sort of like this pseudo-libertarian socialism or whatever sort of brand of socialism that is like, or something like that. They're like, that's what we want. We're not fascist anymore, right? Because it's all teenagers, right? Or older men who act like teenagers, but that still means they're mercurial and very variable, and they're in a constant state of identity crisis. So it can be broken up. Does it look like it's going to be broken up anytime soon? Right now, maybe not.
I guess we will have to wait and see. The book is It Came from Something Awful, How a Toxic Troll Army Accidentally Memed Donald Trump into Office. Dale Beran. We will put a link to your book at majority.fm. Thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.